This is Khartoum, a city of over 6 million people. Until recently, this place was a major hub for trade and communications, with rail lines from Egypt, Port Sudan, and al-Bashir. The people had a pretty normal life. Tourists often come here to experience the rich culture of Sudan, take in the beautiful view of the meeting point of the Blue and White Niles, amongst many other things. But then, on April 15, 2023, everything changed.
Hundreds of civilians have been killed.
More than 6.5 million people have left their homes.
This is war.
People of Khartoum woke up to sounds of gunfire, bullets flying everywhere, and bombs dropping on buildings as war broke out in Sudan. The weeks and months that followed saw more than 12 million people displaced from their homes. The city they once knew is no more. But how did we get here? I want to tell you the story of Sudan. A story of greed, selfish ambitions, and international interference. One that has seen families torn apart, entire communities wiped out, hospitals bombed, aid workers blocked, and countless lives lost. I will show you how different powerful countries are taking part in this endless conflict, all because of the strategic location of this country. This might just be one of the worst wars you've never heard about. The question is, who is fueling this crisis and why?
7 million people are internally displaced by the war.
The Sudan question began with this man, Omar al-Bashir. But before I tell you his story, let me take you back a little to a time when the whole of this region was just Sudan. You see, Sudan's story didn't begin with its independence in 1956. The story is far older, stretching back to a time long before these colonial lines were drawn. Long before the Europeans set foot on the continent of Africa. This place was the home of the kingdom of Kush, a very strong and powerful rival to the Egyptian kingdom, even becoming its ruler at some point. By 750 BCE, the Kushite kings had not only grown powerful, but they did the unthinkable. Led by King Pai, they marched north and took control of the Great Pyramids and temples of the Nile Valley. For nearly a century, Sudanese pharaohs ruled both Egypt and Kush, creating the 25th dynasty. It is what historians now call the Black Pharaohs of Egypt. They restored old temples, built pyramids of their own in Meroe, which, fun fact, has more pyramids than Egypt itself. But empires, you see, don't last forever. The Kushites were eventually pushed south by the Assyrians, and in time, the mighty kingdom of Kush faded into history. Now, fast forward a few centuries, and Sudan was no longer the land of pharaohs, but a crossroads of African and Arab civilizations. Islam arrived here in the 7th century, carried by merchants and warriors from the north. It soon blended with local cultures, creating a unique Sudanese identity. One that was neither entirely Arab nor entirely African, but just something in between. By the 19th century, Sudan had become a battleground for empires. The Ottomans, ruling through their Egyptian representatives, controlled Sudan as a colony, extracting gold, ivory, and most tragically, slaves. This brutal rule didn't sit well with many Sudanese, and it set the stage for one of the most dramatic uprisings in African history. Muhammad Ahmad, better known as the Mahdi. In the 1880s, he claimed to be the chosen redeemer of Islam and launched a jihad against Ottoman Egyptian rule. His forces, the Ansar, swept across Sudan like wildfire, defeating the mighty Anglo-Egyptian armies and even killing the famous British general Charles Gordon at Khartoum in 1885. For a brief moment, Sudan was free, ruled by its own people under the Mahdi's state. But this freedom didn't last. 1898, Britain returned with machine guns and vengeance. At the Battle of Omdurman, they wiped out the Mahdi's army in a brutal fight. Sudan was once again under foreign rule, but this time it wasn't just the Egyptians, it was the British. For the next 50 years, Sudan was ruled as an Anglo-Egyptian colony. The British government, in cooperation with the Egyptian government, administered northern and southern Sudan as separate colonies. The British saw Sudan as two separate entities, the largely Arab Muslim north and the predominantly black Christian and animist south. This is very important to our story. You see, they actively prevented the two from mixing, banning Arabic in the south and enforcing separate laws. This was the signature move in all British colonies: divide and rule. But it would also become the blueprint for a future civil war. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952 finally led the march towards Sudanese independence. Having abolished the monarchy in 1953, Egypt's new leaders believed the only way to end British domination in Sudan was for Egypt to officially abandon its claim of sovereignty. At the time, the two areas were meshed into a single administrative region after political pressure from the northern elite. This act was allegedly taken without consulting the minority southern leaders, further escalating the tension. Also, the British colonial administration seemed to favor the northern elite during the decolonization process. They were granted a majority of political power during the transition. This resulted in the tension between the two boiling over. By the time the British packed their bags, the country was already at war in what would be Sudan's first civil war. You see, the moment Sudan gained independence, its leaders faced an impossible question. How do you unite a country that has been fundamentally divided for a century? The North, with its Arabic and Islamic heritage, wanted to shape the nation in its image. The South, while being the minority with its African and Christian identity, wanted autonomy. By 1955, these irreconcilable differences led to a brutal civil war when southern leaders, fearing northern domination, took up arms. The war dragged on for 17 years, ending in 1972 with a fragile peace agreement. But peace on this side of the Nile never lasts. By 1983, the government in Khartoum imposed Islamic Sharia law on the entire country, including the Christian South. This was the breaking point. The Second Sudanese Civil War erupted, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, lasting until 2005. As this war raged on, this man, Omar al-Bashir, would capitalize on a weak government to install himself as the new military ruler of Sudan. It was 1989. Sudan was already a country in turmoil, condemned to its second civil war. The people were suffocating under economic collapse. The so-called democratic government led by Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi was weak and struggling to keep the nation from unraveling amidst political infighting. Then, in the early hours of June 30th, the radios went silent. The streets of Khartoum were suddenly filled with tanks. By the time the airwaves crackled back to life, a stern voice announced that the government had been overthrown, and the man behind this coup was this little-known army officer named Omar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir. At the time, no one could have predicted it, but this seemingly unremarkable military officer would become the longest ruling dictator in Sudan's history, dragging the country into genocide, war, and collapse, a nightmare that would last for 3 decades. Born in 1944 in a small village in northern Sudan, al-Bashir was a soldier through and through. He had fought in Egypt's war against Israel, climbed the ranks of the Sudanese army, and by the late 1980s had been assigned to fight in the south against the Sudan People's Liberation Army. That war, the brutal, never-ending struggle between Sudan's Arab-Muslim north and its African Christian south, would become al-Bashir's obsession. When he seized power, he justified it with the usual dictator rhetoric that the government was corrupt, the economy was failing, and Sudan needed strong leadership. But the truth was much darker. Behind him, lurking in the shadows, was the real architect of Sudan's descent into Islamic authoritarianism, Hassan al-Turabi. Al-Turabi, a radical Islamist ideologue, had a vision of turning Sudan into a theocratic state. With al-Bashir as the frontman, Turabi pulled the strings, transforming Sudan into an Islamic fundamentalist regime. Al-Bashir wasted no time. He abolished political parties, dissolved parliament, silenced the press, and filled prisons with dissidents. But his real mission wasn't just controlling Sudan. It was winning the war in the south by any means necessary. For the next 16 years, al-Bashir waged an all-out war against South Sudan. But this war wasn't just between armies, it was a war against civilians as well. He used starvation and terror to keep the people in check. His government bombed villages, burned crops, and cut off humanitarian aid using famine as a weapon. Millions were displaced. 2.5 million people died from this conflict. In order to secure his power and fend off opposition, al-Bashir decided to get a little creative. He assembled a group of militias in the western part of the country. This would become his own personal military force of some sort. This military force was led by a commander nicknamed Hemeti, and they served his purpose, like in 2003 when a rebellion erupted in Darfur, a vast arid region in western Sudan. The rebels, mostly from African ethnic groups like the Four, Masalit, and Zagawa, accused Bashir's Arab-dominated government of marginalizing them. Bashir's response was to unleash terror on them. He armed this brutal Arab militia he had gathered for missions like this, giving them free rein to terrorize Darfur. Entire villages were wiped out. Women were raped in systematic campaigns of humiliation. The Sudanese Air Force bombed refugee camps. By the time the world started paying attention, 300,000 people were already dead and millions had been displaced. The United Nations, as always, called it ethnic cleansing, but without any action to stop it. The United States called it genocide, but Bashir didn't care. He knew that as long as he kept the military, the Islamists, and his loyalists happy, he was untouchable. By 2009, the International Criminal Court (ICC) issued an arrest warrant for al-Bashir. This made him the first sitting head of state to be charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was now an international fugitive. But in Sudan, he was still the man in charge. Soon enough, he rebranded his militia, calling them the Rapid Support Forces. To pacify Hemeti, who is the commanding general of this militia, al-Bashir allowed this group to do whatever it likes. Now, according to leaked bank records and corporate memos, this army soon turned into a lucrative business empire with gold mines and lots of other operations. The group also runs smuggling operations, patrols the borders, and offers its fighters for hire in regional conflicts. Some of its high-profile customers in this illegal gold trade were reported to be foreign powers like Russia and the United Arab Emirates. This warlord Hemeti soon became super rich, and his influence was growing fast. He now had tens of thousands of soldiers under his command. When South Sudan officially broke away in 2011, Sudan lost 75% of its oil revenue overnight because most of its oil wells were located in the south. Inflation soared. Food became unaffordable. The country was super broke at this point. All this making al-Bashir very desperate. There was no more money left to oil this war machine he had built to keep him in power. By 2018, Sudan's economy had collapsed. This was when the protests started. First, it was students, then workers, then entire cities. The streets of Khartoum were filled with chants against the dictator. The unrest spread like wildfire, and what started as anger over food prices became a full-blown revolution, demanding an end to Bashir's reign. For months, al-Bashir held on. He unleashed the police, but the people kept coming. They demanded democracy, a chance to elect their own leaders. In a desperate move to salvage the situation, al-Bashir ordered his security forces to crush the uprising. But there was just this one problem. No one wanted to save him this time. The SAF under General Abdel Fattah al-Bourhan had been sidelined for years. Hemeti's RSF, though loyal on paper, was not willing to go down with this dictator. These two separate military units that al-Bashir had used to stay in power finally turned against him. April 11, 2019, after 30 years of dictatorship, Omar al-Bashir was finally overthrown. People poured into the streets celebrating, waving flags and chanting songs of revolution. It felt like a new beginning, until it wasn't. Even with al-Bashir gone, Sudan was still not free. With Omar al-Bashir out of the picture, the biggest question was, who would rule Sudan? The people already did not trust the military and wanted a civilian government, real democracy, not another general in suit. But it seemed like the generals had other ideas. The Sudanese army leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Bourhan, quickly took charge, followed closely by the RSF warlord billionaire Hemeti. They promised democracy, but not just yet. Instead, they formed the Transitional Military Council, TMC, in August 2019, with Bourhan as the leader and Hemeti as his deputy. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a compromise of some sort. This council was a coalition of civil political groups and military juntas created to make Sudan's government look like a democratic government. This arrangement promised to pave the way for elections after a 39-month period, with the military junta ruling for 21 months and the civilian leaders ruling for another 18 months. But this was never a true partnership, as the both were buying time and figuring out how to hold on to power indefinitely. Bourhan, representing the SAF, wanted to restore the traditional military's dominance, while Hemeti, leading the RSF, saw himself as Sudan's true power broker. Soon enough, the battle between these two men will be inevitable. On October 25, 2021, just months before the civilian government was set to take over, Bourhan and Hemeti did what Sudanese generals have always done. They staged a coup. With the civilian prime minister arrested, the fragile transition was suddenly over and the civilian government dissolved. But shortly afterwards, by December 2022, the two men in the center of this coup turned against each other. It all started when al-Bourhan agreed to indeed give control of the government back to the civilians on the condition that the RSF no longer be an independent military but be folded into the official Sudanese army so that he would control it. This plan would sideline this billionaire warlord Hemeti. All hell broke loose. Hemeti had built this military group into a money-making machine, building a business empire on the back of their illegal exploits. He was never going to let the government take that away from him. To prevent this plan of al-Bourhan from going into effect, Hemeti decided to overthrow the government and take over power. On the morning of April 15, 2023, Hemeti sent 2,000 of his men to the military compound housing al-Bourhan. His plot was to assassinate this general, but the plan failed. General al-Bourhan escaped, but not before 35 guards were killed in the onslaught. Soon enough, the conflict spread throughout the capital of Khartoum. The country is soon engulfed in yet another war. Sudan's capital has since been reduced into a war zone, with airstrikes, artillery shelling, and street battles destroying homes and displacing millions of residents. The SAF, overwhelmed by the attacks, moved its headquarters to Port Sudan. The RSF, seizing the moment, occupied government offices and airports, tightening its grip on power. In Darfur, the same region that had endured genocide 2 decades earlier, RSF fighters and allied militias have capitalized on the recent violence to carry out acts of terror. They stormed villages, massacring civilians, setting homes ablaze, and erasing entire communities. As the war rages on, different foreign powers are watching keenly, trying to secure their country's interests at a time when Sudanese are left stranded in refugee camps. Sudan's strategic location makes it a prize too valuable to ignore. It serves as a bridge between North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. With it comes access to the Red Sea, a key global trading route. Whoever controls Sudan controls more than just a piece of land. So, as the war drags on, it is understandable why foreign powers will tend to move towards securing their nation's interests. For the Gulf states, Sudan was already a multi-billion-dollar investment. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had poured money into Sudanese agriculture and ports. Meanwhile, Russia wanted a foothold in Sudan to establish a naval base on the Red Sea. In April 2023, reports suggested Egyptian planes were bombing RSF positions. Egypt denied involvement, but satellite imagery told a different story. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who were longtime allies, found themselves backing opposing sides in Sudan. Their competition wasn't just about Sudan, it was about control over the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Saudi Arabia immediately threw its support behind SAF, wanting to maintain stability and keep Iran's influence at bay. The UAE, on the other hand, had a different plan. It backed Hemeti and the RSF, reportedly supplying them with weapons, drones, and even medical aid, using Chad as a secret supply route. The relationship between the UAE and the leader of the RSF reportedly dates back to 2018, when Hemeti sent combatants into southern Yemen to fight against the Houthi militia. Gold has been one of the main drivers of the Sudan conflict, as it allows both parties to fuel their war machines. Hemeti's RSF controls Sudan's vast gold mines, and the UAE was the #1 buyer. It receives nearly all the goods smuggled from Sudan and had become a hub for laundering trafficked gold into the global market. Recent data shows that officially the UAE imported precious metal from Sudan valued at about $2.3 billion in 2022. In April 2024, reports from the Sudanese government indicated that the UAE was supplying the RSF with arms through Chad and Cameroon. And Ukraine's involvement was a major twist no one saw coming. On September 19, 2023, CNN reported that Ukrainian special forces had likely launched drone strikes against Wagner-backed RSF positions near Khartoum on the 8th of September. Some called it payback for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Others saw it as a warning. Either way, Sudan is now part of a much bigger war. A June 2024 BBC investigation found evidence of both Iran and the UAE violating the UN arms embargo by supplying drones to opposing sides in Sudan's war. Analysts say Iran's support is part of a broader plan to secure access to the Red Sea. So, you see, what began as a power struggle between two generals has now turned into a war without borders. But while this power struggle continues, millions of innocent Sudanese are paying the price. The war that erupted on April 15, 2023 has not just refused to end, but has swallowed everything in its path. And now, Sudan stands at the edge of a catastrophe so immense that the United Nations has called it one of the worst humanitarian nightmares in recent history. Over 12 million people have been forced to flee their homes. That's more than the entire population of Belgium, which is 11.7 million people. These are not just numbers, they are families torn apart, children wandering through refugee camps without parents, and entire villages wiped off the map. More than half of Sudan's 48 million people, over 25 million people, are now facing severe food insecurity. Famine is creeping into the country, swallowing communities whole. The question is no longer if people will die from hunger, but how many. The most devastating part of that is that the hunger is man-made, as both warring sides are using food as a weapon. Both factions have blocked humanitarian aid, refusing to allow food into enemy-controlled areas. And if war and starvation doesn't kill you in Sudan, disease just might. The country's healthcare system is barely clinging to life, as attacks on hospitals and medical centers have become a routine. According to WHO, at least 26 documented assaults have occurred, leaving 80% of hospitals in conflict zones non-operational. Entire cities have been stripped of medical care. In Khartoum alone, half of the city's hospitals have been either bombed, abandoned, or taken over by fighters. In West Darfur, not a single hospital remains standing. Disease outbreaks have compounded the crisis. Measles, cholera, and diarrhea are spreading unchecked across the country. By September 2024, cholera had officially become an epidemic with over 5,692 cases and at least 185 deaths. And in just 4 months, more than 1,200 children died from disease outbreaks in refugee camps. More than 90% of the country's 19 million school-age children can no longer access formal education. Schools have become battlegrounds, bombed in airstrikes, seized by armed groups, or turned into weapon storage facilities. In January 2025, the US State Department announced that members of the RSF and allied militias had committed acts of genocide, imposing sanctions on RSF leader Hemeti and SAF leader al-Bourhan for their roles in systematic atrocities and obstruction of humanitarian aid. Neither side in this war appears ready to stop the fighting, and as the months pass, Sudan continues to slide further into ruin, all because of greed and selfish interest.